So what I'm going to, can you hear me? Yeah. What I'm going to endeavor to do now is discuss the um, social actions and public discourse that Baha'is engaged in on race from the early 20th century up until 1960. Um, and I periodize this a little bit. It so happens that uh, the contours of the Baha'i community also reflect the contours of what was going on in African American history in certain ways. I think there was a shift in the kind of resistance to oppression that occurred around the early 20th century with the Niagara movement, uh, somewhat challenging the movement for racial uplift that most educated African Americans and most African American Baha'is were somewhat involved in the early years. So from, let's say, 1909, 1910, when the NAACP and Urban League were formed, up until the beginning of the race amity conferences in 1921 is a nice periodization, I think, and then what I call the race amity period, 1921 to 1936 or 7. Um, and then from 1937, that dovetails fairly closely with World War II and the attendant changes, again, to what is now called the long civil rights movement. Different strategies were undertaken during the war and the post-war period. And again, in 1960, they changed again with a lot more direct action, civil disobedience and so forth. And I'm not going to talk about the civil rights movement. There's too much to say, but too many Baha'is and too many activities. But in any case, even during what I do discuss, I'm going to leave things out because there's Baha'is were doing too many things, and I can mostly provide some examples, um, uh, especially after the 1940s. So the Baha'i community began here in the 1890s. There were very few scriptures, and it took some time for Baha'is to absorb the concept of the teaching of the oneness of mankind. You do start seeing some activities around 1909, maybe a little earlier, and there were writings published before then that talk about the oneness of mankind. The first, I would say, the first response to these teachings were efforts to teach African Americans, because it was mostly European descended people who had become Baha'is. And the first instance I know of that, it was Marie Botté in New York, who wrote to Al-Baha asking permission to dedicate her life to teaching African Americans. And Al-Baha was very enthusiastic in his response, but told her it was a very hard thing to do. And in any case, she did continue on that. Um, I think partly through these efforts of teaching, Baha'i started to come into contact with African American intellectuals, some of the leaders of the community. For example, Roy Wilhelm uh, hosted Mary Church Terrell at his property in 1910, fairly early on, and around the same time, Louise Boyle became acquainted with James Wendell Johnson, a very prominent writer, musician, diplomat, and later leader of the NAACP. she remained friends with him to the end of his life. And I don't know how they met, but anyway, that was there. Horace Holly had extended correspondence with William Stanley Brathwaite, a very well-known poet and editor. And then, of course, when Louis Gregory and Corley Cook and later Alley and Locke became members of the community, there were a lot more connections made, especially, I should say, Louis Gregory, who had very extensive social networks from Fisk and from Howard University, from his work in the government, and then his travels just made him a bundle of connections, and a lot of things wouldn't have happened without Louis Gregory, I think. As I said, most of the educated African Americans in the Baha'i community were involved in the movement for racial uplifting. And the new organizations, of course, came in response partly to the Great Migration that had already started. I think the Urban League functioned more as a settlement house for African Americans, and the NAACP is more interesting in some ways. It was seeking legal remedies and public discourse as a mode for removing some of the obstacles to racial equality. At the time shortly after the NAACP was formed in 1909, a number of Baha'is joined it. Albert Hall was one of the early members. James F. Norton in New York City had been lecturing on racial issues for years and was on a number of committees at the headquarters in New York City. George and Corley Cook were members. Joseph Hannon was a member, and George Latimer in Portland was a member. Of course, he probably became friends with Beatrice Kennedy, who was president of the NAACP in Portland and did become a Baha'i. The first time I'm aware of that Baha'is engaged in any public discourse on the issue of race was in 1909 in Washington, D.C., when Dr. Fairreed and Joseph Hannon gave public talks on the Baha'i teachings on race. I might note that Star of the West declined to publish Joseph Hannon's printed discourse on this because it was too controversial. The next thing the some Baha'is participated in was the Universal Racist Congress in London. They sent Albert Hall there as a representative of the Baha'i community. There were a couple other American Baha'is who were there, and it seems the Baha'is had quite a presence because the Congress was opened by Alice Buckton reading an ode and that she had written, and Abdul Baha wrote a letter that was read at the Congress, preceded by an introduction on the faith. And in addition, before the Congress started, the week prior to that, local Baha'is had held a series of evening meetings that they described as preliminary to the Congress, in which a number of issues, mostly from Asia, were discussed, and some of the attendees thought that was the best part of the Congress, believe it or not. At least that's what was reported in the press. Now, I don't know whether Baha'is came into contact with W.B. Du Bois there or other civil rights leaders. But I think that well, Du Bois, in any case, already knew about the faith and had, he knew Louis Gregory and had at least one Baha'i book that Gregory had given him. He also lectured at this place in 1910 on as part of the promotion for the NAACP, trying to recruit members. And so he was familiar with it. I don't think too many other leaders were. However, that all changed the next year when Al-Baha came to the U.S. Shortly after he arrived in New York, the New York Times sent a reporter to interview him. That reporter was Mary McLean. She was an immigrant from the Caribbean, and she asked a number of questions about race. It just so happens that Mary McLean also worked for the NAACP as helping to edit Crisis. And so she was very elated by Al-Baha's response and, talked about it with Du Bois and others. And as a result, the invitation was issued to Al-Baha to speak at the NAACP convention in Chicago. Al-Baha's just his attendance, let alone his speech there, as well as his meetings with a number of settlement house leaders in Chicago, brought him into contact with some of the future leaders of the civil rights movement, particularly the Urban League in Chicago. And one Baha'i, Dia Baghdadi, made a point of keeping in touch with these connections that Al-Baha made. One of them, Olivia Bush Banks, who's pretty well-known author. She's mixed Indian or indigenous and African-American blood, and her writings reflect that. She was fairly well known for that. But she was the first director of the Chicago Urban League and a friend of Baghdadi's. In other places Al-Baha visited, particularly in Washington, D.C., which was part of the South, Al-Baha made very positive impressions on thought leaders in the African-American Baha'i community. I mean, the African-American community, sorry. Partly because he insisted on desegregated meetings, even in Washington, D.C., where it was hard to find a place that would allow a desegregated meeting. Baha'is had to look around to a significant extent to find such places. Partly because he spoke out so directly against racism, and because he spoke at African-American venues. But there are some other things that he did that I think are interesting. He reframed skin color as, using the garden metaphor that we're all familiar with. He reframed blackness specifically, sometimes referring to using the metaphor of the people of the eye, without which we can't see. He pointed out, and sometimes he used the metaphor of dark soil, which is the most productive soil for agriculture. He also reframed interracial marriage, and sometimes I think this is something we've skipped over and missed, because he talked to, white supremacists were saying that mixed race marriages weaken the race and the children are weaker and so forth. Al-Baha said the opposite. He inverted that whole argument and said that the children of mixed race marriages will be stronger. I think somewhere, he used the metaphor from livestock, that crossbreeding brought stronger offsprings. Anyway, and of course, we all know he endorsed the marriage of Louis and Louise Gregory, and that marriage really did become a symbol of the Baha'i community's endorsement of racial equality. What is a little less known is that there were a couple other interracial marriages in the within a decade. Let's say one in Washington D.C. Theodore and Daniel Tate, and in New York, James Simpson and Carol Stride. Neither of them are as well known. They were, both of the men were Baha'i teachers for a time, and D.S. Tate traveled with Louis Gregory in the 1916 or 17, I think it was. In any case, all of this was picked up by the African-American press and spread throughout the country, and with just effusive praise. I'm going to give you a couple examples here. This is from the Chicago Defender. Quote, "His visit to Washington has been a triumphal march. He has met and conquered South prejudices. He was the guest of one of Washington's wealthiest women, yet her house has been thrown open to rich and poor, black and white." And from the St. Paul Appeal, few Caucasians even preach the equality of mankind. With Baha'is, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man is not only a theory, but a practice. Now, I dare say that these were a bit overstated, but for our purposes, maybe that doesn't matter because it's the impact it had. But we know that that there was resistance within the Baha'i community to integrated meetings, at least in Washington D.C. And by the way, that really came from Harrison Dyer. He was at the root of it, even in the 14? He was a scientific racist, as they called them, and he was married to a Baha'i, and he was, sort of meddling behind the scenes and engineered the efforts to have white-only meetings and black-only meetings, and for a time there were mixed. There was one mixed race meeting at all, so there were 3 different Baha'i meetings, and till in the later 18 or 17, the Baha'i community consulted and reintegrated the meetings and adopted a position that any meeting with publicity had to be integrated, and any meeting of the community itself, it wasn't just a private personal meeting, had to be integrated. And you could hold, in other words, you could hold a private fireside in your home that was segregated, because a lot of the argument was, and it was probably true, that whites wouldn't come to an integrated meeting. And so if we wanted to teach whites, there had to be some entree for them into the community. And this, I will say, this same argument came up when the faith started to spread in the South in later decades. And that remained the standard, what they came up with, that remained the standard. In the wake of Abdu'l-Baha's visit, I would say that the primary race-related efforts by the Baha'i community were still teaching African Americans. There are a couple of incidents of what you could call social action, I guess. One in 1915, when Albert Hall hired the secretary of the local NAACP as part of his law firm. That, I think that was fairly significant, and at least positioned him on the right side of the history. And then in Portland, Beatrice Kennedy was pioneering these meetings. She called, they were interracial teas. And they, it was it was not a Baha'i activity. It's just something she did, but they were very successful. And the way they worked was that, they were interracial, but, and they were for women only, but uh, you had to sit with someone who, of the opposite race, or not opposite, but another race, I should say. And, it did have some effect from what I've read, in breaking down barriers. So that was fairly successful. But at any rate, I think Baha'is were primarily focused on teaching for the rest of the 1910s, but with teaching African Americans came the issue of integration, and that popped up in a number of places. And we already know about Washington, D.C. and New York. The growth of African American Baha'is in Harlem led to something really interesting. One of the most interesting experiments I think the Baha'i community undertook at that time. There was a mixed race group in Harlem, predominantly African American, but there were Baha'is of European descent there too. And they began meeting in Harlem instead of Midtown Manhattan, just out of convenience, I think. They started meeting at a commercial establishment, but then they got permission to start meeting at the Emmanuel Church, which was a spinoff of the AME Zion Church, and with a progressive pastor who actually declared his faith in Baha'u'llah a couple of years later. Now, one of the members of this group, named William Davenport, you probably never heard of him, started holding interracial dinners in his home. And these just kept growing and becoming more diverse. And they started holding them at the Emmanuel Church, where they grew even more. And it really evolved into a kind of community in its own right. And they call it the Rainbow Circle. They had one dinner a month with a different cuisine from everywhere in the world each time, and usually representatives from the country from which that cuisine came. There were all sorts of cultural activities, but they also had regular discussion group meetings. They had classes, Esperanto classes, for example. And they had service projects, they had field trips. I mean, it was really quite an operation. And almost every Baha'i in New York and New Jersey participated in this at one time or another. But at any rate, they one of their field trips, the first one actually was to the Teaneck Unity Picnic. And they went en masse to that. Anyway, it became very popular, very visible, and really kind of a real badge of honor for the Baha'i community in New York, from the people who at least valued diversity. And even some critics of the faith, I will say, said that this was a good thing. So it did come to an end in 1922. I don't know why. The Baha'i stopped meeting at the Emmanuel Church, and the Rainbow Circle stopped meeting there too. And I haven't come across a reason for that. I do know that Richard Bolden, the minister, was still very friendly with Baha'is up into the 30s, and was a member of a regional Baha'i committee that tried to coordinate inter-community affairs in the New York area. And the Rainbow Circle was considered such a success that there were plans to try to do the same thing elsewhere. The only place I know this happened was in Montclair, New Jersey. And it didn't last too long, and it relied on some of the same people who were involved with the Rainbow Circle in Harlem. They did meet a few times, and I don't know what became of it. Now, in Chicago, the teaching of African Americans was really difficult because of because they were confined to what was called the Black Belt, a small section of Chicago along the lake, and they eventually did find someone who would allow meetings, and then another person, Mary Byron Clark, became a Baha'i, and they started meeting at her house, and there's quite a story there. Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, I better move along then. Yeah, I talked that long. Okay, well, sorry. Mary Byron Clark was actually an activist herself, and she was selling homes to African Americans outside the boundaries of the Black Belt, and consequently trying to expand the Black Belt. It was a strategy that that activists were engaging in it at the time. They figured that if one Black moved into a street, then all the whites would move, and they'd be able to have more opportunities. It didn't work out that way. In the race riots of 1919, her house was bombed 3 times. She and her husband were arrested, and that was that. They stopped holding meetings. They stopped holding meetings there, and had to move on. Well, I will try to quickly move on to the race amity period, and I'll skip over some things since I'm running out of time. I do want to say I do want to point out that Louis Gregory was absolutely essential to the race amity, the success of the race amity movement, partly because of all of his contacts. A lot of the people who appeared there were people he already had met with during his travels or knew from various lives he had, but more than that, I mean, he gave scores of lectures on racial issues, on prejudice, on race amity. In fact, the year after the first race amity conference, that's almost the only topic he ever touched on, and he continued that into the 30s, and it really did prepare the way for this success of the race amity conferences. There were 21 conferences that I know of in 17 localities, and but the movement was gradually becoming localized, so that by 1937 there were 9 communities with race amity committees, and another 11 that had regular race amity meetings, and this was out of about 50 communities at the time, and maybe 3,000 Baha'is nationwide. It was pretty impressive show of force, so to speak. I did want to point out that in New York City, where both the Urban League and the NAACP were located, there were about 4 or 5, I guess 5 Baha'is who had really insinuated themselves into the cohort of civil rights leaders and become personal friends. Ludmilla Bechtold had been friends with Du Bois fairly early on, and Mary White Ovington. Louise Matthews came in a little bit later, and Menta Trotman and Viola Bibb and Cora Horn. They were very active socially in the middle class African American society. And they had become friends with people like Roy Wilkins and Walter White and James Hubert. And so I think these friendships were really important because I think they paved the way for the next 30 years or so of Baha'i activity. Although race amity activities ended, there were race unity activities a couple of years later, and those went on for decades. And Roy Wilkins, I can't remember when he retired, but he was still evincing some, trust of Baha'is right up into the end. It's also well known that there was a 1932 dinner for the leaders of these groups. Is that it? Oh, gee, I didn't even get into the 1940s. Oh, well. Let me just say that I think that people don't realize that 1932 dinner that the Baha'i sponsored actually was an effort on the part of those organizations as well. They were trying to recruit Baha'is. They were trying to cultivate relationships with Baha'i, so much so that Arthur Schomburg persuaded a musician from Fisk, Edward Matthews, to come and perform for free at his own expense because Louise Matthews liked his music. And Arthur Schomburg, I'll just throw this one thing out appears to have been a covert Baha'i. There were a few of them throughout this period, like Leslie Pickney Hill, even Elaine, anyway, yeah. I think the leading figures were reluctant to go public with that, but Arthur Schomburg, when he became head of Fisk University, invited Louis Gregory to start Baha'i classes there. And in the letter that Louis Gregory wrote to him afterwards, he had addressed him as dear Baha'i friend. So, go figure. Okay, I didn't get to the later period, another time, I guess.
So again, so we have that wonderful figure that is so hard to stop. Because we look like it's in the angry and here they have and we will be here the whole weekend, so don't have to talk to anyone stop this in the meantime. We have time for lots of questions and it was already here.
It's going to make a comment because I studied this at Howard about W.E.B. Du Bois. And, many people don't know that his wife actually was a professor at the Atlanta University Center.
Right.
And he did recognize the Baha'i faith. He said, I'm not a religious man, but if I was, I would be a Baha'i.
Yeah.
And he also said, well, what happened in those meetings that you were talking about that were segregated, there was a meeting in Tennessee, and
I know, yeah.
he came and the white Baha'is judged him. And so he was angry with the faith for a while until some other Baha'is found out and they said, please don't judge us for these people. They're holding on to some things that we are trying to eradicate from our community. And he came back. So Nia Du Bois was their daughter, his first wife,
Right.
She was a Baha'i. And she had more children that were Baha'i, even into the 1960s, in Atlanta, these people were Baha'i, and they were recognized as people. Where I live now, they knew these Baha'is that were from the Gouads all that time. And I will say also, when I was at Howard, one night I was having such a terrible time studying, and I looked and there was a book with Elaine Locke. And I opened it up, and what do you have to say to me? And I saw that, you know, he was writing letters to children, you know, and they were
Yeah, he was.
in communication, and all of these people, you know, had this connection that even my father said, and I don't know where he got it from, that Abdul Baha, Martin Luther King knew who he was, you know, and that he knew who Abdul Baha was, he believed in it. But like you said, they had a hesitance because of the Black church and their connection to that, and they knew they had an obligation to the Black church to withhold that. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I just add something about the incident that occurred, I was in Nashville in, I think it was 1937. The upshot of that was, you know, Du Bois wrote an article not attacking, but saying that the Baha'is had segregated this meeting, which wasn't precisely true. They just limited the number of African Americans because the hotel demanded it. But over time, you know, lots of Baha'is wrote to Du Bois about this, and he stuck to his guns and believed who he believed. But eventually Lawrence Houts befriended Du Bois. He was a Baha'i in Milwaukee. And this was, of course, in the years when he was sort of on the outs with the NAACP and was going to be prosecuted for communist affiliations and all that. At any rate, he hosted the Du Bois and befriended them and became very close friends. And in fact, there's been this mystery about why Du Bois was trying to go to the Baha'i India conference. You know, it shows up in his FBI files. Well, it's because the Houtses were planning to go there. They were pioneers to Africa by then, and he was planning to meet up with them.
Can we give round of
Yeah, we're trying to lessen the members.
Flash flood one. Okay.